Hello there, guys, and welcome to our next class for the fourth unit. Just like you know, this is a class that is part of the high school and 9th BYS. We are working on the subject biology, and this is week number 29. Let's go over our presentation and let's start with our end in mind, which is students will be able to provide the class with a clear explanation about examples and theory of the natural selection. And here you have a summary of the activities that you need to complete today. Number one, read the rest of lesson number one. Remember that we were studying this lesson last week, and we covered 5 pages from the lesson. So now it's time to continue with the other 5 pages. And after you have finished reading lesson number one, I need that you look for 3 different examples of natural selection. And you need to include pictures for these examples. Number 3, explain each one of the examples in a brief paragraph. So, for example, you can talk about the adaptation of regular birds to polar bears, or you can talk about the different types of beak that birds have, depending on what region they are living in. And of course, the necessity that they have gathered from that specific environment. And be creative. You can do your research on internet and of course include that in your notebook. I need that you complete the book exercises from pages 171 to 175. Then number 5, make a compilation of your work and upload it to Educativa. It's important to remember that in the illustrations that you are going to have, before you illustrate and everything, you have to add the date, end in mind, title, and then you include the examples, okay? It is not necessary to write down a summary. That's not necessary for today. I only need the 3 examples of natural selection and, of course, the explanation of each one of them. So with that being said, we're going to start with our lesson, and we will start talking about artificial selection. So, when we talk about artificial selection, I really like to bring up this example. So, there is this theory that says that dogs come from wolves. So, my question is, how is it possible that this wolf can actually be changed into a domestic dog? Well, let me tell you a little bit about history and the way scientists have presented this theory as well. So, what has happened is that scientists mentioned that at some point in history, humans started to develop a certain relationship with wolves. So they noticed that if they will start feeding wolves, they will become very protective over them because they will be like their main source of food. So after that relationship was built, what happened was that they kept on interacting among each other and developing this dependent relationship, let's say. So what happens then is that humans will actually be part of the interaction that the baby wolves would actually have with the rest of the species. And humans will actually start picking up the wolves or the offspring that they will consider the best. Which ones are more friendly towards humans, which ones are the smartest ones, or which ones are simply the cutest ones. And they will try to promote those traits in the following offspring that will come in the next generations. So, and after they will spot the mutation that they would like, and they will actually try to preserve it over the years, then that's exactly how a wolf that we can observe in the left can become like a very cute and friendly dog from the right. By artificial selection, this is not something that only happened in nature, but actually humans it started selecting the organisms that they would like the most. And that's the way they changed the organisms. And this is something that also called Darwin's attention. And Darwin studied that the offspring of domestic animals were different than the ones of the wild animals. So it's basically because of that. At the end, the scientists have come to the conclusion that In fact, domestic animals are different because they have been selected by humans for hundreds of years, if not millions of years. All right, and remember, the previous one was artificial selection. Now we have to talk about natural selection. So, have you ever wondered why rabbits have a lot of offspring? Well, trust me, a long amount of offspring. And why do they reproduce so fast? Well, the individuals that adapt to better will survive. That's basically what natural selection is. Those who do not adapt will be extinguished. So, and at the end, the species that have survived until today have been able to adapt to the conditions around them. And overproduction is when a lot of offspring are generated, and they might not be even enough food and resources for all of them. And it can be a defense mechanism. So this is exactly why rabbits produce a lot of offspring when they reproduce. Because what happens is that rabbits have a lot of natural predators. So if they will only produce one or two babies, what's going to happen is that the species will be extinguished because the predators will actually eat them easily. So rabbits have a greater chance of survival when they have a lot of offspring, because probably a couple of them died during the process of growing up before reaching the mature age to start reproducing. But since there were too many of them, the surviving specimens would actually continue reproducing. And that's basically a defense mechanism. Probably they cannot protect against the predators, but they can actually overproduce offspring in order not to be extinguished. We also have something called variations, changes that a specimen suffer to adapt to its environment. So let's suppose that at some point there were certain rabbits that will only produce 2 or 3 offspring. And there were some other rabbits that will produce many more, like 8 or 10 rabbits at a time. So the rabbits that will produce very little amount of offspring will actually be extinguished because they didn't have enough offspring or enough overproduction in order to survive in their environment. But those who actually developed this increasingly amount of offspring, they were able to survive. And that's part of variations, the genetic variations or mutations that happen in organisms in order to adapt to their environment and have more chances to survival. Also, we have something called competition. A species fight for food, survival, and reproduction. So definitely in the wild, we are going to find what we know as alpha males. So let's think about a group of wolves. So you know that in wolves, there is always going to be an alpha male, which is going to be the strongest wolf of all, and it's going to be the one that is going to lead all of the group. So this specific one, this alpha wolf is going to have more chances of reproduction because he is going to be above in the scale of the group. And those other male wolves that are only followers are going to have less chances of reproduction and survival. So in the natural world, there is a constant competition for survival. And of course, it can be for food or even reproduction. And there is also something else that is known as selection, which is the best characteristics that adapt to the environment will be predominant in the species and change it over time. So let me think of another example that I can give you about selection. Let's think of giraffes. So you know that giraffes have an extremely long neck that helps them out to eat the leaves from very tall trees. So at some point, what happened was that there were some giraffes that didn't have a neck that was long enough in order to reach the leaves or their food from very tall trees. So basically what they had to do was to look for other trees that would be way shorter in order to be able to eat. But in their environment, unfortunately, usually trees tend to be very big. And of course, it requires them to have actually a very long neck in order to feed, among other animals. So, what happens? Which one do you think will survive more? A giraffe with a short neck or a giraffe with a long neck? Basically, it will be a giraffe with a very long neck. So that's part of natural selection. So those specimens that can't adapt appropriately to their environment are going to be extinct in a while those who actually adapt and are able to survive will continue changing the species over time. Because giraffes with very short necks are not going to be able to survive in the environment, so they only have to die and let the other ones that have adapted remain alive for the rest of time. And we can also talk about environmental changes. So how is it possible that chameleons can actually change the color of their skin and actually generate some camouflage in order to survive predators? So animals need to adapt to their environment conditions in order to survive. These adaptations are translated into genetical variations, which are generally mutations. The changing genes that support adaptation will be trespassed from parents to offspring. So going back to the example of chameleons, let's say that you have a chameleon that can actually change color and one that cannot. So which one can actually survive the most? Which one can evade predators the most? Of course, the one that can actually change color and mix itself with the rest of the environment. And of course, that mutation that once a certain chameleon's offspring had is going to continue in the rest of generations in order for the chances of survival of the species to increase. All right, and lastly, we have another example right here. I guess I mentioned this last week, but it's always good to remember about it. So, at some point, there were some bears that lived in the forest that actually migrated to the North or South Pole. But the problem was that they weren't white. They kept on being brown. So, it was very difficult for them to survive in that environment because otherwise, as in the forest, in which they can actually camouflage with the rest of the environment, in the snow, they will be pretty easily to spot for their prey. So they wouldn't be able to actually catch enough food to survive, and at the end, they will die. So what happens? So at some point in birds' history, what happened was that there was a certain mutation in the fur of this species. So basically, instead of being brown, there was one baby that appeared with white hair or white fur. So which one do you think will have more chances of survival? A white bird or a brown bird? Of course, if we talk about the North Pole or the South Pole, where mainly it is full of snow and actually a white environment, then the birds with a white color will have way more chances of survival since they will be able to mix with the rest of their environment. And this is basically the way polar bears were generated over time. So they were the dominant species that were naturally selected to survive in this environment, and brown birds couldn't survive there, so they just disappeared from that specific location. And that'll be about it for the lesson today, guys. Thank you a lot for coming, and I will see you during the live session in a couple of minutes. Always take care. Goodbye.